First things first. I'm not a caretaker, though the visitors insist that's the only thing I could be. Crazy old Mr. Locke, crusty caretaker to a haunted house. My official position is gamekeeper to Koel House. By the time the visitors figure out what the game is, it's usually too late. The smart ones, the ones who might listen to my warnings, usually have the decency to ask about local history. But even they only want the horror stories, the massacre of the Koel family by their victims, the murderous ghosts they left behind, the cursed vault of stolen treasure, and if they want something raunchier, Alice Koel's ghost seducing visitors. In fact, this history is based on legends, all of which I can easily debunk. Koel House was built in 1857, 4 miles from the small Maine township of Indigo, and commissioned by Edward Koel, scion of one of the wealthiest families in the state. The resulting 3-story Gothic mansion wasn't built on a Native American burial ground, nor were there any satanic rituals in its construction. The entire family didn't live in the house and certainly didn't exploit this to conduct incestuous orgies. In fact, the only point when all of them were under one roof was the Christmas reunion of 1895, when the mansion was home not only to Edward and his wife Gertrude, but also their 4 adult children, Julian, Livia, Rufus, Alice, plus their spouses and lovers, and their grandchildren, Miranda, Adrian, Sarah, Anna, Gideon, and Marcus, who ranged from 14 years of age to barely a month old, not to mention 40 servants, 10 horses, 8 hounds, and 1 cat. And in all the decades Koel House was occupied, there were no kidnappings, no murders, no torture cellars, and no victims escaping to take revenge. What killed the Koel family was a particularly deadly strain of influenza in the winter of 1895. With heavy snowfall imprisoning the family in the mansion for the duration of the Christmas party and beyond, the disease spread quickly among the inhabitants, and by the time the blizzards had subsided enough to allow help to arrive from Indigo, the Koels and all their servants had been dead for weeks. Even the animals had starved to death. A tragedy, but a little too simple a beginning for a ghost story. Perhaps it's not so surprising that people made up gory backstories to explain the haunting. But then, that's the final rumor I can debunk. Koel House isn't haunted. Not by ghosts, at any rate. It's just a house, and like all houses, it wants nothing more than to be lived in. But unlike other houses, it will do anything to get its original residents back. And that's where I come in. Koel House has always needed a gamekeeper. Granted, there's precious little game left on the sprawling estate, except for the tourists who keep climbing over the wall. Despite all the efforts of the Indigo Town Council to keep Koel House secure, people just can't be dissuaded. Not by the keep out signs, not by the threat of arrest, not by razor wire, and not even by the jungle of giant hogweed and sumac planted around the wall. To outsiders, the house is just too alluring to resist, exactly as it intended. That's why the mayor of Indigo began hiring gamekeepers again, not long after the Koels died. This time he paid beggars, orphans, veterans, ex-convicts, ex-lighthouse keepers, and other isolated folk to stay on the grounds full-time and keep watch. The duties were, and still are, deceptively simple. Give the trespassers one last chance to turn back, and if that fails, clean up the evidence. I live in a shack just 100 yards from the gate. Thanks to Indigo's tourist dollars, there's a network of CCTV cameras keeping watch over the grounds and corridors of the house, so whenever a newcomer clambers over the wall, I'm ready to offer them a cup of coffee and a friendly warning. Regardless of whether I'm dealing with tourists, burglars, ghost hunters, or YouTubers, I'm never confrontational. I remain welcoming, informative, and even though they're trespassing, I always assure them I'm not going to call the cops. Quite apart from the fact that local police aren't allowed inside the walls, most of these intruders are younger than me, and it's not uncommon for them to arrive in packs. Most don't listen to my warnings, and don't even want the coffee, but there's not much I can do about that. Once they've been warned, I'm not supposed to make any effort to stop them. For a while, the visitors go about their business inside the house, exploring, filming, ghost hunting, showboating, looting, or just marveling at the fact that the house hasn't decayed at all since the day it was abandoned. Then they get curious about a particular bedroom. There's no rhyme or reason to which one attracts them. Something about it just seems to call to them on an instinctual level, to the point that they can find it without checking the floor map. Once inside, they start to feel sleepy, just enough to make them think they'd feel better if they sat down. Most doze off, and that's where their story ends. Next morning, I'll have clothes to get rid of and a car to dismantle. But otherwise, these visitors are a self-disposing problem. But as for the ones who fight through the drowsiness and leave the building, well, they can't run forever. The moment they set foot in a bedroom, they're as good as dead. But in the meantime, someone needs to keep them from revealing Koel House's secrets. So I send a text to the mayor and follow them. On the upside, their first port of call is almost always a bar, either to celebrate a job well done or to calm their nerves. Either way, that gives me a chance to catch up with them. If I'm in luck, it's the psychological symptoms that show themselves first. An antiquated word here, a moment of forgetfulness there, or perhaps they recall a memory that doesn't seem to belong to them. Every bedroom has its own distinctive behavioral effect on the visitor, some easier to recognize than others. The ones who were lured in by Alice's room are quite distinctive, for instance. They're the ones who aren't drinking, and if the sufferer's mind drifts enough, they can be seen unconsciously stroking their belly. By far the easiest to recognize are the poor souls who visited the children's bedrooms. If they're not poking their tongues out at each other or exchanging juvenile insults, you can usually catch them absently picking their noses or sucking their thumbs. Eventually, the victim notices that they're starting to forget their old lives. That's usually their cue to stagger away in confusion. In that state, they're easy to escort to my car, and their growing disorientation makes it almost impossible for them to put up any kind of resistance while the physical symptoms kick in. By the time we get back to Koel House, the process is usually complete. Where things get inconvenient is when the physical symptoms show themselves first. Picture the scene at the bar, the latest intruder ready to share another tall tale with their fellow thrill-seekers about the weird and wonderful things they saw, maybe even show off a souvenir or two, and then something about them changes in a way that usually only they notice at first. Perhaps their clothes seem a size too big for them, enough to make their shoes simply slip off their feet, or maybe their shirts are suddenly tight across the shoulders, as if meant for a much smaller wearer. Perhaps they notice gray hairs that weren't there a moment ago. Maybe they find that they'd gained weight in odd places. Maybe their stomachs are suddenly very sensitive, enough to make them vomit after a single beer. More upsettingly, they might themselves shed clumps of hair, or even losing teeth. More than once, I've seen a happy treasure hunter suddenly cough a bloody molar into their hand and be left staring in horror at it, paralyzed with fear and confusion. As soon as they notice something seriously wrong, the victims either bolt or go into hiding. By itself, this isn't much of a problem. Most only last an hour or so before they're fully converted, and few last longer than a day. But in that time, there's always the risk of them hurting someone, or worse, revealing the truth about Koel House to more respectable tourists. So it's the gamekeeper's job to track them down. I remember the first case I handled on my own, back in 1999. My predecessor, Mr. Gatewood, had retired after spending his final year showing me the ropes, and I was eager to make a good first impression for the mayor. That year, 2 enterprising thieves tried to rob Koel House of everything they could carry. They ignored my warnings, of course, and ended up being lured in by the master bedroom, barely fighting their way through their fatigue to escape with the best of Edward and Gertrude's jewelry. I found them at a motel on the outskirts of Indigo an hour later. By then their hair had turned gray, their faces were lined with wrinkles, their backs were bent with advancing years, and before my very eyes, their bodies were casting off well-developed muscles, growing skinnier by the minute. Before long, One of the burglars needed Gertrude's spectacles to see further than a few feet, and the other had developed a limp that required him to walk with the gold-headed cane he'd stolen. "What's happening to us?" one of them wheezed. "Are we dying?" "Far from it," I told him. "In a way, you're going to live forever." Of course, they didn't understand what I meant by that. In tears, they begged me for a cure, promising to give me everything they'd stolen if I'd cure them. But then, they'd assumed I meant that they'd be trapped in elderly bodies forever. After a few minutes of arthritic joints and failing eyesight, they thought that their symptoms were as bad as they could get. The physical transformation occurs in fits and starts, each stage a little more horrific than the last, and by the time the second of the two burglars realized who he was becoming, they'd upgraded to offering me everything they'd ever owned. So I ushered them out to my car, promising to find them a doctor. In truth, I spent the next hour driving around in circles, listening to the muffled crunch and squish of my passengers transforming, doing my best to ignore the increasingly confused mutterings from the back seat as the transformation ate its way into their brains. The last coherent sentence I heard, before the two victims lost consciousness and their whimpering finally died away, was a muffled gasp of, "Who am I?" By the end of the journey, the two burglars were gone, and Edward and Gertrude Koel had been reborn. They were bewildered by my car and the state of indigo, and Gertrude was more than a little annoyed at finding herself dressed in men's clothes. But other than that, they returned to Koel House without incident. They settled back in, threw their old clothes away, redressed in the fineries they had in life, forgot the outside world, and resumed their usual routines, which Koel House is all too happy to accommodate with the miracles at its command. That was in early January, and over the course of the next few months, the illegal tourist trade brought in replacements for every single member of the Koel family and their servants, and Koel House took them all, like some kind of reverse cuckoo stealing eggs from other nests to raise as its own. I remember thinking that eventually the tourists would start to avoid the place as word of mouth spread, or, if I was unlucky, that I'd make a mistake while cleaning up the evidence and bring the FBI down on our heads. Of course, the house proved me wrong, and not for the last time either. Apathy kicks in quicker than usual under Koel House's influence. Even if a connection is made to the house, police and the FBI dismiss the disappearance as unsolvable, and the scandal only makes the house more alluring to profiteers and thrill seekers. Even the few witness reports to hit the internet are eventually disregarded as tall tales, hence why I'm allowed to write this confession in the first place. Only the most blatant, irrefutable evidence can break the spell, which is exactly how the mayors of Indigo and US gamekeepers are made immune. I suppose I should be grateful for the fact that Koel House is a mobile service dead zone. Otherwise, social media would have blown the lid off our secret years ago. But for all its inexplicable power, Koel House isn't a god. It can't keep its converted population alive forever, and after a few months transformed, they're already starting to fray at the edges until they simply can't be sustained at all. I witnessed this firsthand at the end of my first solo year, when the reborn Koels gathered for a reunion party. As they always do in December, once enough victims have been assimilated. This was before the indoor CCTV cameras were installed, so I was watching from the corridor, fighting the lure so I could spy on them up close. At the very moment Edward gave his last toast of the evening, the Koels and their servants groaned in exhaustion and began to melt, their faces softening beyond recognition and dribbling down their necks, their bodies liquefying, pouring out of their clothes in groaning rivulets, until all that remained were writhing, mumbling puddles on the floor. No sooner had I recovered from the shock, the puddles oozed downstairs into the deepest of Koel House's cellars. There, in a vast underground cistern, they pooled, settled, and drifted off to sleep, briefly sprouted eyes, fluttering as they descended into endless dreams. But even in sleep, they murmured with dripping, half-formed mouths, and voices belonged to both the Koels and the visitors, speaking of things that both had experienced proof that their minds were perfectly preserved in liquid form. And there in that cistern they remain to this day, along with every victim Koel House has ensnared since it was first abandoned. The next month, Koel House began luring in new tourists, ready to begin the cycle again. You'd think the sight of people being reduced to living syrup every year would be the worst part of this job, but you'd be wrong. I've seen worse than that. First, there's the luckless bastards who get lured into the stables or the kennels. Apparently, Koel House misses its animals just as much as its people, and every so often I have to tranquilize a naked man-shaped hound that'll bite anyone that gets too close. Or worse, a tourist galloping through the night in terror, limbs distending into hooves as they flee, screaming for help in a voice that sounds less human with every word. On the upside, all three variants tend to avoid strangers, so preserving secrecy isn't too difficult. Plus, the ones who turn into the family cat tend to sleep through their own transformations even if they escape the house. Then there was my well-intentioned mistake of 2001. I'd become convinced that the effects of the transformation would stop beyond a certain range, that if I could just drive 3 escaping intruders as far away from Koel House as I could, they'd be safe. I was so excited once I dropped them off, thinking it would mean the end of my tenure, that Indigo would never have to resort to such desperate measures to keep its secrets ever again. 2 hours later, a wounded hitchhiker was admitted to the local hospital, screaming about a monster in the nearby woods, and while she was being sedated, I drove off to the area she'd mentioned to investigate. In a way, I'd been right. There was an effective range to Koel House's influence, but that didn't mean that the transformation would stop without it. It just meant that, without the house's guidance, the transformation became disorganized. The result was a skinless, blood-dripping, centaur-like fusion of a horse, Julian, and his wife, Maria. It had a head that wasn't quite that of a horse, 2 merged pairs of hands in place of front hooves, Julian's body fused with the horse's belly, and Maria's armless torso writhing on its back like a misshapen fin. I had to shoot the thing twice in each head before it finally stopped trying to kill me. Getting rid of the body took even more effort, and wrecked the blade on my chainsaw too. Also, that was the night I learned that Koel House screams when it's denied a resident. Needless to say, my attempts at altruism ended there. Of course, I'm not the only one who's tried to resist Koel House. I could tell you stories about the times when Indigo's town council got fed up with keeping secrets and tried to demolish Koel House, but all end the same way, in failure. Even artillery hasn't left a dent in the house's miraculous facade. Sometimes, though, a victim manages to resist Koel House through sheer Herculean willpower, and that can be the most horrific sight of all. In 2012, a 40-year-old ghost hunter by the name of Bill Harker paid a visit to Koel House. He ignored my warnings, of course. He wanted the big find, the one thing that could convince academia that he'd been right and get his wife to reconsider divorce. And as bad luck would have it, he was lured into the nursery. He left in an RV parked just outside the wall, but he wasn't hard to follow. His driving became increasingly erratic, likely because he was getting too short to reach the pedals. I caught up with him at a gas station on the far side of town, and to my surprise, he didn't seem to have changed at all. But he looked up as I approached, and for a moment, his face was that of a terrified 9-year-old. But then he clenched his eyes shut in effort, and suddenly he was an adult again. Then, he drove off. As he later admitted, he was convinced that something in the area could break the curse, and he spent the next few days searching for it, holding back his transformation through strength of will and almost never sleeping for fear of changing in his sleep. After a week of tracking him all over town, I finally caught him at midnight on the 7th day, trying to ram-raid the occult library on Ambrose Street, thinking they might have a cure for his condition. Unfortunately, he was regressing so frequently by then that he couldn't keep his foot on the gas. In the end, Harker could only bang on the door with his shrinking fists, oversized sleeves flapping like windsocks as he screamed for attention in a voice that fluctuated between adulthood and childhood with every other word. When he saw me, he didn't run. All his strength was focused on staying himself, and that strength had been dwindling all week, leaving him shifting from adult to child to toddler and back again. Maybe you've seen films and TV shows that try to make rejuvenation look wondrous or even cute. In the real world, it's second only to animal transformations in sheer horror. Imagine the limbs shrinking out of adult proportions, the muscles withering away, the body bloating with infantile fat. Imagine the clothes continuously deflating. Imagine the sound of the bones crunching with every change. It is, not to put too fine a point on it, gross. And Harker got to experience it on a loop. But even after I told Harker that there was no chance of cure, the ghost hunter didn't give up until his wedding ring slipped off his finger. I still remember the howl of anguish he let out as he lunged for it, scrabbling in the gutter for the ring as it rolled towards the stormwater drain, watching helplessly as his last link to his old life plunged out of sight. When he looked up at me, his eyes were full of tears, and I could tell at once that the last ember of hope in him had just been extinguished. Without saying a word, he handed over the keys to his RV and let me drive him to his new home. On the way, I could see him shrinking as he willingly surrendered to his transformation, allowing Koel House to remake him entirely. By the time we got back, he had to be helped along the path through the grounds, and in the last few yards he had to be swaddled in his enormous jacket and carried to the porch. But it wasn't until Livia greeted me at the door and took him from my arms that the last vestige of Harker's personality finally faded from his eyes, and all that was left was baby Marcus. Not everyone is forced. Some visitors believe my warnings and willingly give themselves to Koel House. Now you might assume the only people who could do this are spiritualists, death worshippers, or people chasing dreams of immortality. In truth, those who most commonly give themselves to the house are Koel House's own gamekeepers. I mean, think of all the years we spend here with no human contact, except with disinterested visitors and the house's oblivious inhabitants. No vacations, no friends, no family, only isolation, free groceries, just enough of a salary to buy entertainment, and the offer of a pension at the end. The gamekeepers of Koel House rarely have anything to retire to. None of us bother with the pension. Instead, we choose a room of our own free will and join the household, especially if a terminal diagnosis is involved. The first of us, Mr. Lintel, retired with tuberculosis and chose to be reborn as Livia. Free at last from this loveless husk without family or beauty, the final line of his journal read. He even opted to leave his chosen room, just so he'd remain conscious enough to feel his body changing and his identity eroding away. Mr. Gatewood's predecessor, Mr. Turnkey, was left on death's doorstep by a stroke and escaped into the role of Gideon, erasing his lifelong drunkenness and rage with the exuberance of the family's happiest grandchild. And Gatewood himself was diagnosed with stomach cancer and ended his days as Rufus, gladly accepting the eccentric artist's lifestyle as his escape from his grim, austere identity. Based on my family's medical history, my retirement's probably going to be brought about by Alzheimer's. You might think that's why I'm writing this confession, for the sake of preserving my memories until I can train a replacement. In truth, I write as a substitute for conversation because I need at least a semblance of human contact, not just to stay sane, but to give me the strength to keep myself from joining the household before it's my time, because sometimes I'm so tempted. Every year I watch the family being reborn a little bit at a time, living out their half-lives in Koel House, unable to comprehend time or the world beyond their walls. Every year I descend to the cistern to look upon the lake of past victims bubbling and warping in their sleep, dreaming for eternity with all the others of their kind. And all I can think of is how happy they all are,